last night. I hope that you had a chance to see the live stream recording, and that is available for you if you haven't seen it. So you just go to the front page of our parish website, rocklandcatholic.org, and you will see a link to be able to see a recording of last night's conference and all the subsequent ones. So again, we're very, very happy to have you here. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Father Mike Ritter, if you don't know who he is, but I think you already do, which is why you're here. As I mentioned last night, he grew up in this parish. He's currently the pastor at St. Robert's, and he has just a little bit more to go before he gets his doctorate in psychology. So wonderful combination of knowledge in spirituality and psychology, a wonderful combination. So please join me in welcoming Father Mike.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Darcy, and thanks to everybody for coming back. I thought that you might have gone running for the hills after last night. So it's good to be with you again. We took a little bit yesterday, Henry Nouwen as one of our guides. I want to recap with a thought from Henry. He diagnosed the spiritual problem of the modern person, that's you and me. He said that our spiritual problem is homelessness. And what he meant was that God is always knocking on the door of your soul, only to find that you're not there. You know, we're out somewhere trying to find ourselves, trying to find life, or trying to get away from ourselves. And so it's fitting, and we talked about this last night, that the first question of the Bible is God walking through the garden asking the human being, where are you? That's an important question. We looked at that in terms of the mini mental status exam, or what I'm calling the spiritual status exam. Can you tell me your name? Who are you? Can you tell me where you are? And can you tell me what time it is in your life? And we almost got finished. We looked at that in terms of what's going on inside of me. The question that I tried to put in front of you for prayer. So take a minute and think, what has it been like for you really to be you? We talked about what's going on in our relationships a little bit. We talked about what's going on in terms of that sense of timelessness, feeling out of sync. We finished last night looking at our relationships, and I want to wrap that piece up before we move on to our next part, because we left an important piece off. We talked about attachment and how important that is, but what I didn't mention is what you all know, and that is that relationships are hard. And I was sharing with the people at Mass this morning, I was laughing to myself that this year Valentine's Day falls on Ash Wednesday. And I'm very amused that Valentine's Day is occurring on a day of fasting and abstinence. And that image of the heart, which we use, conversation hearts, the candies, the cakes, all of this. And we forget that the heart is a very bloody organ. And that's appropriate because love is a bloody business. And if you're going to love somebody for a long time, there's an awful lot of fasting and abstinence. And that's something good to think about. You know, a precondition for loving is vulnerability, and it means that we get hurt. And nobody can hurt us the way the people that love us can. Nobody can hurt us the way the people we need to love us can hurt us. And so before we move on from this question about looking for God in our relationships, I want to say a couple of things, not to gloss over the fact that sometimes our relationships are painful, and sometimes looking for God means closing doors and recognizing our limits. You and I, we relate to each other, but we relate to each other through a lot of filters. And psychologists talk about this in terms of internal working models. As we're growing up, we have experiences of what love is like. I cry out at night when I'm going to bed, and my mom comes to my room and says, "What's wrong?" So you kind of learn that the people who love me are there when I need them. Or maybe you cry out and they say, "Shut up." And you learn, I better keep some of those feelings to myself. But as we grow up, we learn all kinds of things about ourselves, about our relationships, and about our needs and expectations about how relationships go. And so when we love people, we love them, but we have kind of an internal representation of who they are that may or may not perfectly map onto who that person really is. And you've probably all had this experience where you're pretty sure that you can read your spouse's mind, only to discover that they actually have a couple of independent thoughts. And that can create conflict in the sense that I am always trying to figure out why you don't love me in the same way that I would love myself. Or I'm not getting the love back in the same place or in the same way that I gave it. And that's very, very painful. Another thing that I've been cured of, having lived with myself for 40 years, and having lived with others and walking with others, I've been cured of the illusion that people are always trying to make things better. That's really not true. There's a great story in the gospel. Jesus comes across a pool of Siloam. There's a man there who's been hurting, and he's been kind of frozen in his life for a long, long time. And every time he gets the opportunity to get in the pool and get healed, he's got some reason why he can't get in. I'm not getting better, and it's somebody else's fault. Every time I try to get into the pool, somebody else gets in front of me, and I'm just stuck here. And I know that song because I sing that all the time. I never change, and that's obviously somebody else's problem, not mine. And Jesus asks what should be an obvious question, but I don't think it is. He asks him, "Look, do you want to be well?" And if I sit with that and I'm honest, usually the answer's no. Or at best it's kind of, sort of, in some ways yes, in some ways no, but real change might cost me. And while the cage that I'm living in is a cage, it's pretty comfortable, and I've got a few pictures on the wall. Our relationships can be like that. Our life can be like that. And so I want to poke at that a little bit before we move off of the relationship topic. Let's start with a conversation about original sin, which is something we're familiar with from our catechism days, but we learned it as catechism kids, and on some level we didn't carry with us a very sophisticated sense of what that means beyond some man and some ancient woman ate an apple, and now we're all in trouble and need to get baptized so we don't go to hell. That's kind of the script, right? There was a great movie which was a redo of a redo, which was a make of a book, Murder on the Orient Express. Did anybody see that movie, read the book? Yeah. So it goes something like this, that let's say there are 13 passengers on a train, and one of them gets murdered. He's stabbed 12 times. And a very famous investigator goes around interviewing all of the 12, trying to figure out who did it. He said, there was a murder, therefore one of you is a murderer. And as the story unfolds, we discover one person at a time that everybody on that train has some history of pain, some connection with the victim. He did wrong by my father's business, whatever the hurts were. And what we discover at the end of the movie is 12 stab wounds, 12 passengers. Everybody on the train had stabbed that man once. And that is, in a nutshell, what we mean by original sin. The idea is that you and I were born into a world where relationships are broken, and they were broken before we got here. And a redeemed way of living is about being the kind of person in the world who says, the hurting stops with me. That's why we have those crosses in our houses and around our necks, because we've been born into a world where relationships and people, and we are them, are broken. And so there's kind of a chain of hurting. And being a redeemer means I can take that on and not give it back in kind. It means being the kind of person in a broken world that says the breaking of other people stops with me. But there's something important there, and that is that it's not your fault. And that's something important to name. I mention that because we can talk about finding God in others, and we talked yesterday about the holiest thing you'll ever meet being your neighbor. We talked about looking for God in our relationships. But I want to qualify that because it's important for me as a pastor who walks with people to say that God never wills us to sacrifice our dignity to stay in a relationship. And I don't care what the relationship is. And it's important for me as a Catholic priest to say that to a Catholic community. It's never God's will for you to accept abuse because you're married, or because you're family, or because whatever. See, if we don't protect the integrity of ourselves, it's very hard to feel like we have a self at all. It's never God's will for you to be abused. And so boundaries become very important things. Henry, now and again, he's going to be one of our big guides during the retreat. He used the image of a castle. And, castles are important things. If you're going to build a castle, you build high walls and you put archers on top of your walls. You get a drawbridge with a big gate that you can drop down anytime. You build a moat. On the one hand, you got to think to yourself, if the king needs that much defense, he must feel like a pretty defenseless person. He must feel pretty vulnerable. But now he says that castle is an image for the soul. And one of the disciplines of having healthy relationships is being able to control your drawbridge. He says you have to be in charge of when people come in and when they can't come in. You have to decide when to allow access and when to say, up with this I will not put, because it's a violation. And I think it's important to pull that into our spiritual life, into our discernment, and into our sense of what it means to be God's people. We have to control our drawbridge, because, put it to you this way, I had a great spiritual director who said, when it comes to love, he said, if the gift isn't free, it isn't pure. We have to decide what our limits are. And I think that's something important to say. I heard a great thought once on forgiveness, and this author made the comment. He said, forgiveness is quite simply the name of love, as love is practiced among those who love poorly. And the truth is, and you know this, we should know this, we all love poorly. So among people like you, love doesn't have another name, really, other than forgiveness. And my experience sitting with people is that forgiveness is hard because we have a little bit of confusion about what that means. Oftentimes when somebody comes into the confessional and says, I can't forgive my daughter-in-law, what they mean is, I'm still so angry. I'm still really hurt. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but I don't think forgiveness means not feeling angry and hurt. Jesus tells a story that explains, I think, in the best way what forgiveness means. He said it's like this. It's like a man who owes his master a huge amount of money, like hundreds of years worth of wages. And so he goes into his master and he lies. He says, be patient with me and I'll pay you back. But he won't. He can't. And the master forgives the loan. That's the verb there. The master doesn't say it wasn't a lot of money that you owe me. It was. He doesn't say it doesn't matter what happened between us. He doesn't even say you can continue to be my servant. He forgives the loan in the sense that he recognizes, I'm asking for you to do something for me that you can't do. And I'm not going to do that. And I won't punish you for being unable. That's forgiveness. It's recognizing that sometimes in our relationships, some part of me has been waiting for you to undo the past or to heal something that you can't or won't heal. Forgiveness is the recognition, I've been waiting for a payment that can't come. And I'm not going to do that. Not to me and not to you. And I won't punish you for not having what I now need. I think that feelings of forgiveness follow decisions for forgiveness. I've been asking you to give me something you can't give because you don't have it. And I'm not going to wait for that. And I won't punish you for it. Doesn't necessarily mean that we can continue the way we were before. But it means that I'm not going to be vindictive. And feelings of peace follow decisions for peace. And peace has to be waged, just like war. Now, one made a great observation. I'll read this to you because, that probably looks like hieroglyphics from the back. He said, God created you and me with a heart that only God's love can satisfy. Every other love will be partial, will be real but limited, will be painful. And if we're willing to let the pain not make us bitter, but prune us to give us a deeper sense of our belovedness, then we can be free as Jesus and walk in this world, proclaim God's love wherever we go. Be the kind of people who say, there's a lot of hurt here, but the chain of hurting stops with me. Is that enough on that? Okay. I want to transition now and talk about our second question. Our first question that we started with last night is, where are you? The second question God asks comes from Luke's gospel, and this is the story of the road to Emmaus. Let me lay a little groundwork. This is a day or two after Jesus has died, and we come across two of his disciples who are walking down the road away from Jerusalem towards Emmaus. And something that you need to know is Emmaus is something like what Las Vegas would be for you and me. And so we have disciples of the Lord who were very given to their following of Jesus, and yet they've come up against this apparent failure of Jesus. He didn't liberate the Jewish people from the Roman occupation, so all of their hope, all of their spiritual aspirations seem to have blown up in their face. And where we catch them is in a place of resentment, bitterness, hopelessness, and despair, and they're saying, forget it, let's go to Emmaus, play some blackjack, And we've been on that road a couple of times, to heck with it, I'm out. And as they're on their way, walking away from their faith, walking away from their hope, walking away from Jerusalem, Jesus kind of pulls up alongside them as an unknown stranger, and he asks them, what are you guys talking about? And they were talking about their resentment and their frustration and their disappointment, their aimlessness. And they say, are you the only person around here who has not heard the things that happened here? And Jesus, being God himself risen from the dead, doesn't flash a light in their face and say, get it together, fellas. He asked them to tell them their story. He says, what kind of things? We talked about prayer as an experience in which God asks us, where are you? What's going on in your life? The second question God asks is, hey, I want you to tell me your story, and I want to hear it from your perspective, without the idea that the temptation to believe that there's a wrong way to talk to God. And we've got some of that inside of us. I would like to pray, but maybe I don't have the correct words, or I'm not in the right disposition. This story is important because these two people on the road were in the wrong disposition. They were literally walking away from faith, from Jesus, from all of their commitments. That's where they met God. And that's where he pulled up and didn't say, hello, weren't you listening? He says, tell me about it. I want to hear it from you. Telling our story is a really important thing. I went to the seminary for a number of years at Mount Angel in Oregon, and that was a school that was run by Benedictine monks, and I have a very vivid memory of one Benedictine in particular. Was an old man, ancient of days. I mean, he must have been 130. And but every morning there was a little confessional at the entrance to the Abbey Church. And so if you ever wanted to go, you could drop in. And that was his life. He sat in there for hours every day. He did that and he gardened. And I knew him for, 13 years. And you would go in there and sit down and he would never look at you. But he'd say, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. And he would be hunched over and he'd put his hands behind his ears like this. And you would tell him the story and he would just do that. And then in the end he would go, I want you to make an act of faith, hope, and charity. So you'd see guys, I talked to Father Augustine, I'm faith, hope, and charity, right? But my point is, when I think about God, I have that image of Father Augustine. Like he's somebody who draws near and just wants to hear it from you, the way you would tell it. I'm a preacher, and so I'm always looking for words, and I came across a book on preachers by a Benedictine by the name of Cardinal Hume. And he told the story of a young priest who got up to preach at a homily at a funeral. And he said, guys, today I want to talk to you about judgment. And everybody kind of cringed because this was Grandma's funeral. And now we're going to get this fire and brimstone kind of preaching. And he went on, he says, judgment is speaking into the ear of a merciful and compassionate God the story of my life, which I've never been able to tell. It's a good way to think about prayer. When Jesus steps alongside his disciples who are actively walking away from him in every way that's meaningful, he comes with a merciful and compassionate ear. Tell me the story. That's what prayer is like. A God who wants to hear, not tapping his foot, crossing his arms, asking for an explanation. Because the thing is, the way that we tell our story, especially to ourselves, is the way we tend to live and feel about our story. So the narrative, the story that you're telling is very important. And if anything meaningful in our life is going to change, that's going to be the result of some shift in the narrative. And that starts by telling our story to God. One more thought on this. I was struck by an image from an important thinker whose name was Bernard Lonergan. He wrote a book called Method in Theology. Don't read it. I don't know what he's talking about. I read this stuff and I have no idea. But he did have one line that really captured my mind. He was trying to get definitionally at God, like, what can we say about what God is? And, we have the traditional, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's all present. He said, for me, God is an unrestricted act of understanding. What can we say about God? He's an unrestricted act of understanding. He's a Father Augustine with his hands behind his ears, wanting to hear you, from you, the way you would tell it. Because the story you're telling yourself shapes in powerful ways the way that story gets written and lived and felt about as we move along. We need to hear Jesus asking us to tell him about the experience of disappointment, asking us to tell him how we feel and what we've been through and about our being lost, so that we can heal that story and live it in a life-giving way. So I want to look at this Emmaus story and break it down in a couple of ways. There's a picture there of a book. This is Henry Nouwen, and it's called With Burning Hearts. You can get that for a couple bucks on Amazon. You can get it as a PDF online for free. You can download it today. It's like 80 pages. It's really easy to read. And he talks about the road to Emmaus as an experience of the Eucharist. It's what we do every Sunday. It's listening to God's word and breaking open the bread. And he said the Eucharist, like life, is about trying to journey from resentment to gratitude. We come into Mass and we start with resentment and pain. Lord, have mercy. And we end with this great act of thanksgiving. And so it's interesting. He makes the observation that for the Hebrew, to speak and to create, that's the same word. So when you read the book of Genesis, it doesn't say God created the earth. It says God spoke the earth. It doesn't say God made the light. He said God spoke light, and it was light. And so this kind of Emmaus theology, this Eucharistic theology, it has inside of it the idea that speaking has within it the power to be creative, the power to bring life. This is just an aside. I don't know if I've told you this or not. Have we talked about blessings? No. Maybe we did and you didn't listen. So I've shared with you, I got my start as a priest in South Sacramento, St. Charles Borromeo. And I learned very quickly that blessings are important things. You know, people would come out and be like, Father, will you bless my car? And it was like a car dealership out there. People would come along, you bless all the wheels, all the doors, and if you don't bless it all, they'll come back. Every day somebody's like, Father, will you bless my rosary? Will you bless my knee? I'm going to have surgery. Will you bless my husband? Exorcism status. And but I learned that it's powerful stuff. Every prayer ends with the blessing. May Almighty God bless you. And those are important in part. But, well, what does it mean? The word to bless comes from the Latin benedicere. There's two roots. Bene means good, benefactor, beneficial. Dicere is where we get the word decir in Espanol. Dictionary means to dictate, to say things. To bless means to say good things. Blessings are important because we believe that there's power to give life when we say good things. So it's the same thing here, that word to create and to speak, it's the same. So when we find ourselves in this place where we're walking away from God, or when we find ourselves lost and in desolation, it's important to hear God say, speak, tell me the story, because that's creative and it has power to heal. One of the great insights for me working with people and studying, let's say, cognitive or cognitive behavioral approaches to therapy is I think of it this way. We all live with an internal narrator. You know, we're always talking to ourselves and we're always interpreting. You know, this is what this person said to me, and I also know why they said it because they're a jerk. And, you know, so it's not just what you said, it's what I say to myself about what you said. And that's what I really react to. I'm talking to myself all the time. And because I think all of my ideas are good, I always believe myself. I almost never challenge what I say to myself. And, you know, I generally feel what I say. If I say, gosh, Mike, you're so stupid, I feel pretty dumb. We talk to ourselves all the time. We tell ourselves the story all the time. And sometimes we tell that story in a way that isn't really honest. I wouldn't talk to anybody the way I talk to myself. I wouldn't judge anybody's struggles as failures the way I judge my struggles as failures. You and I have a problem, and it's a storytelling problem. And again, the Emmaus story is important because Jesus catches them in the act of telling a maladaptive story. They didn't quite grasp the details. They didn't see the glory hidden inside of the grief. And he had to walk with them for a long time, not giving them information, but letting them get it out so that they can gradually tell that story in a more life-giving way. If we can tell our story in a more life-giving way, we might just find a little more life. And you know, the best way to do that is to practice, is to find a Father Augustine to find somebody who will sit down with you and put their hands behind their ears and listen with just a little bit of compassion. One of the most remarkable discoveries for me as a priest and as somebody who works with people is how far just a little bit of empathy will go. How far just the littlest bit of encouragement can carry a person. I remember talking to a young guy who came into my office once and told me the sad story, and his memory was I was in an orphanage, and one of the staff people came in and said, Jack, we've called everybody in your family and nobody wants you. Now, I don't know that that actually happened. That's the story that he tells himself, and until we can kind of get that out, be heard, and learn a more life-giving narrative, we can be very, very trapped. So that's where we find our friends on the road to Emmaus. They're trapped in a story that's all pain, it's all loss, it's all desolation. And we need to let God in. We need to let other people in, people who can listen and not judge. Let us tell the story. Maybe help us tell the story in a more life-giving way. Oh shoot, did we skip one? We did. I want to, oh gosh. I want to say just a word about our current environment. We were talking about naming the moment, and we talked about that in terms of what we have going on inside. We talked about it in terms of our relationships. I think we've got to talk about it in terms of our culture and our environment too, because Father Delahunty, you'll remember him, he used to tell me, Mike, you can't go swimming in the water and not get wet. And I thought about that. I think about it all the time. You and I are living in a world that's very much shaped by what I would call postmodern thinking. And postmodern thinking has a couple of important features. One of those features is what we would call deconstructionism. And deconstructionism is kind of the idea that all of these old systems of thinking and governing and being in the world, they need to be dismantled. We don't like the man. You know what I mean? That's so much a part of our culture, we don't even think about it. But old religion is bad religion because, big old things are fundamentally oppressive things and they have to be battled. That ought to be some kind of conflict for you and me because we're part of, something big and old and oppressive under that model. And that's not entirely untrue. I mean, wherever you get 2 or 3 people together, you'll find corruption and the best and the worst of human nature. But that places us in some conflict. Another postmodern idea is materialism. And materialism is not, I like nice things, although I do love nice things. Materialism is the idea that it's all about matter. That the world is the world that I can touch. And that makes spirituality something pretty subjective and something nice to do on a Sunday morning, but not really relevant for our ordinary life. And so we see this especially in first world countries like ours, that the distance between, let's say, faith and religion and social life, we talk about a separation of church and state like that's its own kind of religion, and in a sense it is, because the material is split off from the spiritual, and that leaves us kind of schizophrenic, because we're not really sure where we live. Another postmodern cultural feature is a dualism. This came from our friend Descartes, and the idea was that you kind of split off the soul and the body. So I have my psychologist, and that helps me with my psyche, and then I have my priest, and then I have who helps me with my faith, and then I have my doctor who helps me with my body. And so the soul and religion and faith becomes this strange compartmentalized creature. And so if you were to ask yourself the question, what does it mean to be Catholic today? It's like, I don't know. There's a great book by, I'm just finishing it right now. It's by this guy named Charles Taylor. It's called A Secular Age. And he talks about, if you read old biblical texts, what you'll read is, the schizophrenic person is possessed and so forth. But the idea is that every feature of life was like totally saturated with God. Everything in life had a divine significance. And we live in an era now where, meaning has to be stripped down to the smallest part. And so it's not like you're having a spiritual problem, is you have deficits in your serotonin and your dopaminergic system. You know what I mean? Your molecules, and all of that's true, but we live in a world that's stripping away the meta-narratives and the great stories that give our lives meaning. And we haven't replaced those stories with anything. And so it leaves us kind of floundering and lost, where you've taken away the great structures that kept society and people's lives together and haven't really given them a new structure. And so this whole question about the stories that we tell is something very important. Does that make sense? I'm trying to say? A little catch up for the missed slide. Here's our third question, and in the last 20 minutes I want to reflect on this tonight. This comes from John's Gospel. This is the first conversation that Jesus has with his disciples in John. You'll remember the story that Jesus goes out to the Jordan to be baptized by John, and then sometime later, John is kind of standing around with his disciples, and he says, "Look, there's the Lamb of God." And John's disciples go after him. Jesus stops, he turns around and sees them following him, and he asks them, "What are you looking for? What do you want?" And again, we talked about for the Old Testament, the first question God asks is, "Where are you?" For John, the first question Jesus asks is, "What do you want? What are you looking for?" And that's an important question for prayer. What am I up to? I often tell the parable about a man who's riding on a horse down a dusty road, and somebody stops him and says, "Sir, where are you going?" And he thinks about it. He says, "I don't know. You'll have to ask the horse. I'm kind of along for the ride." And spiritually, there's a lot about that that's true. We've got all kinds of stuff going on inside of us that we're not always honest about. I said to you earlier, it's not obvious to me that we're always trying to make things better. You and I are riding on some pretty powerful stuff, and we would do well to let Jesus probe a little bit and ask us, what are you up to? What do you want? And one of the problems that we have is that you and I are pretty smart. We've been doing this for a long time. We know how to get along. We know what's expected. We know what's acceptable. And so if somebody asks you, "What are you about?" you know what the right answer is. But that's not helpful, because it's probably not true. If you were to ask me at any moment, hit pause and be like, "Mike, why are you doing that?" I'd be like, I don't know. I'm here. I'm doing my thing. And so one of those huge, tasks for prayer is to let Jesus stop us in our tracks and ask, "What are you up to?" Disrupt the automatic pilot. What am I about? What am I after? The disciples, they respond in the appropriate way. They say, "Well, we're looking for you, essentially. Rabbi, where do you stay?" Which is a good question. That would be like me coming in saying I'm a priest and you saying, "Well, where do you say Mass?" And Jesus says, "Well, come with me and stay with me, and you'll find out." And John tells us that they did stay with him and they did find out. And that word to stay is a really big deal in John's gospel. It's the same word that gets translated as remain. Remain in me as I remain with the Father, and remain on the vine, and you'll be the branches, and so forth. Throughout the whole gospel, we get this. You're looking for me, stay with it. Anybody who's been married for a long time, been Catholic for a long time, had a job for a long time, knows about the power of staying with it as we kind of get after whatever it is we're getting after. A couple of images here in terms of what you're looking for. This question gets played out for John in a very cool way. Jesus asks him, what are you looking for? And then he poses throughout the story a number of incorrect answers. We're looking for signs. And Jesus says, no signs will be given. They're looking for bread at times, but that isn't enough. They're looking for healing, but that isn't always enough. A couple of them are saying, Lord, command that my son sit one at your right and one at your left in your kingdom. That's not right either. The story ends in an interesting way with Mary Magdalene at the tomb. Jesus has died. Mary comes out, and Jesus appears to her, and she thinks he's the gardener, And the gospel ends with Jesus speaking her name, Mary. It's me. And for John, he ties the bow around the gospel that way. He says, what are we looking for? Ultimately, we're looking for God to speak our name. We're looking for God to choose us, call us, accept us for who we really are. And that's the whole story for John. What am I up to? I'm looking for God to speak to me with love and acceptance and understanding, to call me anyway after all that's been said and done. A couple of images. Henry Nouwen talked about what he called the first love, or principles that were branded on the soul from the very beginning. Lonergan, who I talked to you about, he spoke of first principles. The idea is that when you're born, you're born with a nature. You're not just like tabula rasa. There's nothing there. You're not born as a blank page. And philosophers would say you're born with first principles branded into the soul like a horse or cattle. Beauty, goodness, truth, and so forth. So much so that somebody can pull you out on a beach, have you look at a sunset for the first time and say, isn't that beautiful? And you can say, yes, it is. It's beautiful. But nobody taught you that. You already knew it. You just never articulated it until that moment. And so some of the ancient world religions, they'll say you can't really learn things you don't know. You can only kind of wake it up inside of you. And so Nouwen talked about what he called the first principle of the perfect experience of being loved. The idea is that when God makes the soul, he calls you into being through an act of perfect, unlimited, absolute divine love. A love so powerful that a new person is made, something like that. And he suggests that some part of you still remembers what that was like. He calls it a dark memory of once having been loved perfectly. He says we spend the rest of our life chasing after that, and it's always just a little bit beyond what I can get my hands around. I live with the dark memory of once having been loved perfectly, and every other love gets kind of held up against that almost memory. The legend goes that you had this experience of perfect love, and then God sent an angel to seal your lips so you can never speak about it. And they say that's why you have this cleft on your lip, from the angel sealing your lips closed. They also say that's why when you try to remember something, you always go like this. You and I, we live with the dark memory of a perfect love, and we all imagine what that might be like, and it never really is all the way there. What are you looking for? I'm looking for that. Oftentimes in very, very kind of destructive ways. Lastly, I want to say something about some of my brainier thoughts, brainier meaning brain process. I'm reading a very interesting book right now that's called the dopamine, the molecule of more. It's very, very cool, and it's very accessible, and this kind of stuff, I mean, it's just great. And it points out that you and I, one of the motivational chemicals in your brain, dopamine is a huge part of your reward pathway. But the kind of pleasure that we get from clicks on our cell phone, or a really nice glass of wine, or a line of cocaine, or whatever it is that you do in your free time. It's about sudden, unexpected rewards. And that's important because that kind of motivational process in the brain, it keeps us alive. It motivates us to act and to pursue things. And what's really interesting from a dopaminergic standpoint, the pleasure is not in having. The pleasure is in getting unexpectedly. It's like when you get your first paycheck, you're like, yes, it came. After a couple months, it's like, it's still the same paycheck. Why isn't this more? So they talk about that, the dopamine as the molecule of more. It's the reason why no matter how much I have, I can never have enough. And one of the challenges is that, when there's something you want or something you need, we live this little fantasy. Let me tell you a story about me. I was walking through Macy's the other day. I had to buy a tie, because I'm looking for a supervisor clinical psychologist to accrue my licensing hours. And I figured if I showed up in a black suit and a Roman collar, that would be off-putting to the people in the mental health field. So I went to buy a tie, and I was walking by all those watches. And I looked at one, and it was nice, and it was like $800. So it was really nice. And I was like, oh man, that would look great. And I was, honest to God, I was standing there thinking about it, like, do I have $800? And it's like, and I drove home thinking, like, what? Am I gonna go home and walk around like this all the time and be like, this is beautiful, But we have these fantasies that we just think, wow, this is gonna be great. It's gonna be great. And then we're so let down when you go home and it's not great, and then you're out $800. Like, what is that? And so, again, I find this text or this question really helpful because it helps me to burst the bubble. When I get all worked up about the things that I need, or whatever, it helps me to be like, Mike, what are we doing here? And kind of returns me to myself. What I'm really looking for is some kind of relief for that itch that I can't ever really kind of scratch. And I think the core insight for me is that ancient insight of St. Augustine. Until I can find a way to channel all of this unrest to you, oh God, I'm going to be a very deeply frustrated person and probably pretty destructive. So I want to stop with that for a moment, and I want to ask for you to do some work. We've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about the question as to where you are in your life, what it's been like to be you, what's going on inside of you in your relationships. We've talked about the importance of telling our stories and telling our stories in a way that's life-giving, the need to be able to listen. We've talked about the need to identify what it is we're really up to, what it is we're about, what it is we're after. Those are my insights. What are yours? This brings me back to Macy's, because I often have felt as a preacher that I feel like I'm in Macy's talking to the mannequins, You just have all this kind of faceless crowd, and they're just kind of looking at you. But what people don't realize is that I'm looking at them too. And so we can do volunteers or victims. My hope in these sessions is to propose ideas for you to take home and think about and pray. Before we do our wrap-up tomorrow night, I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? Yeah. I did get my tie, yeah. And I haven't worn ties in a long time, so I'm surprised by how much they cost. Yeah. Yeah, Greg.
You mentioned about the secular age that the book, and I think that's always, especially currently, a big challenge. You also mentioned in your last little segment there, the word "we." How do we do this, and how do we look at things and recapture our story? You said it in the plural sense, meaning primarily in the singular sense. How do you recapture the story? How do I recapture the story? Do you have any insights or suggestions on starting retelling our story as a community?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the community insights? I think two things. One, I have a lot of very good memories of family holidays, where everybody comes over for Christmas, let's say, and my uncle Dave would come over and would tell the same story every year. And everybody laughs. It's just hysterical. It's part of the deal. But there's so much identity in our stories. We tell stories because they make us who we are, in a sense. As I say, individually, we, in a very real way, are the stories we tell about ourselves. But that's also, we've got a national narrative. We're Americans, and we believe in liberty and justice and all that. That's a story. And it makes us who we are, and it dictates policy, and it moves politics and economics. Stories are very, very powerful things, and they're social things. And so to do that, my suggestion is it's very important that we do that, and we do it intentionally. Every time we come to Mass, we listen to the same stories. You're not going to come in on Sunday and be surprised by some other gospel. We come here because those stories, they make us who we are. In the same way that, your parents told a story about you, my parents told a story about me, your name is Mike and you're my son and you live here, and that came with a lot of trappings, a lot of benefits. So, being intentional about telling our stories, and fundamentally them being stories about us belonging, I think that's very important. I don't know if that answers the question. I think we do that. My sense of things is all theology these days and all politics is apologetics. And it's me defending why my way of seeing things is the way to see things. And we talk at each other instead of talking to each other. And so if we want our narratives to be life-giving, we've got to listen. God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. What do you think he wants you to do? He wants you to listen. I have found that most people who come to me to talk, they really come to talk. They don't come for help, and they don't come because they want to change, or if they do, very ambivalently so. They come because they need somebody to hear them. So I would say start there. You really want to transform something, do it by being a great listener. I've done a lot of research on this, actually, like what makes a good psychotherapist, or what makes a good listener. And you'll hear all the techniques, lean in, imitate their body language, and fire those mirror neurons and all that kind of stuff. But I think the best advice that I've come across is, if you want somebody to feel like you're really listening to them, then really listen. Yeah, I mean, really. But that's not what we do, because I usually, when people come talk to me, I listen, and what that means is I'm waiting for you to stop so I can say what I just thought of while you were talking. You know what I mean? If you want to be powerful, let that go and listen with a view to understanding what it's like to be this person. I want to try to get inside of what you're telling me. I want to perceive what it's like for you to be you. That's how I would start with the story thing. Was that a roundabout way of getting there?
Nailed it.
At least I nailed something. Yeah.
Henry doing? Is he a psychologist? Is he Catholic? Have you found in your studies any good Catholic psychologists, or is there one you can recommend that kind of ties those two worlds together, those two worldviews in a sense?
Now one was a priest and was a psychologist, so he's a good one, although his project isn't fundamentally a psychological one. Catholic, I'll say this, there aren't a lot of Catholic psychologists, but we've been doing this forever. So being honest, I wouldn't want to shoot from the hip. I would want to think about that and shoot you an email, maybe with some recommendations. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How do you, are there any tools to look at how, if you have your story, but sometimes your story is maybe, could be looked at differently and still be a good story as opposed to your bad story that you're telling about yourself? Are there tools to look at? I always like to go back to, I think it was Covey or one of them talks about the family in the train, and that those two kids that were acting, real crazy. This guy riding the train, and he's like, you need to control your kids, and they're not, they're just misbehaving. And then when the gentleman tells them, well, their mom just passed away, and then so he turned the way he looked at it, he saw that their mom just passed away. You can excuse that behavior for a moment, but it's the same exact story. It's just told from a different angle. Is there tools to sometimes you have a certain path that you think your story looks like, and it might be some fabulous story that you're not even seeing, or you're not even noticing that God's put in front of you.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I think one of our problems is that we've all got our PhDs in mind reading. When something happens, we assume that we know why. In part, they speak of that as the fundamental attribution error. If I cut you off in traffic, it's because I was running late and I didn't see you. If you cut me off, it's because you're a jerk. You know what I mean? So I'm always making attributions, because the real question about life isn't so much what happened, it's what did it mean? You know what I mean? That's where we live. It's not, she pressed her lips on my face. It's she kissed me. What does that mean? And so that's the first thing that I would say is we're interpreters, and the problem usually lives in the interpretation more than it lives in what happened. And we've got to be honest with ourselves. I'm reacting to my reaction, and that's where I live. So what I found really helpful is just stopping that automatic process, because the cognitive insight is thoughts lead to feelings, lead to behaviors, and it's just autopilot. And so can you disrupt? I'm doing it. I'm reading his mind again. And sometimes that's enough just to catch myself saying, I'm interpreting. And I'm getting mad about my interpretation. Maybe I should ask, what are you thinking? They talk about that in terms of like reframing. So reframing is simply a question of, okay, here's a thought. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to actually consciously evaluate it. Is it fair? If I were to take it to trial, would a jury convict me? Is there enough evidence? Can I make the case? Because I've swallowed my interpretation whole, but it might not be fair. I find that my problem is the process is pretty automatic. And so if I can catch myself in the act of reading somebody else's mind, just catching myself in and of itself is a lot. Yeah.
One thing just to add, I think you said it pretty good, but try to force yourself into seeing it from their perspective.
Yeah.
What do they value and what do they
Yeah, trying to see it through their eyes. You know, one of the things that I have seen a lot, and just in my own work, is, you know, I have a parish in Sacramento, and there's people that I see every day, and they come in and their kids are screaming, and I've got one guy that I can't figure this out. This gets under my skin. If you're watching, sorry. But I'm up there, you know, I'm trying to pour myself into a homily, and he's got one earbud in all the time. And I'm like, dude, what are you listening to? Like, I want to ask him. So you see that going on. You see people, and you think, oh, they don't really care. And then, you know, somebody like that comes in and says, you know, my wife died, like you said. My experience is that life is wonderful. It's also very, very hard. And I haven't met too many people who aren't doing the best that they can, and usually struggling mightily and with an awful lot of integrity. And what I found is what's going on inside of me is very often as intense and as painful as what's going on inside of you. A little bit of reverence for that. Compassion, I think, has been very helpful. Other thoughts? Yeah, I think that's a great, great suggestion. You know, and I kind of think of writing as a structured way of thinking, you know, and so telling your story, writing it down, so then we can steal your story and put it on the website. I think is a good idea. Any other thoughts, comments? Yeah.
So you mentioned about, as far as telling your story, and I heard very much that part of consciousness is naming things. You know, how do I describe a rock or something? If there's not a name for it. So is telling your story basically naming it so that you're conscious of it and understanding it? Is that kind of the idea?
You know, that's I would want to think about that. You know, it's interesting. The Genesis story. You know what Adam's job is to name everything. You know, so he gives names to the animals and all of that. You know, you remember the story. Everything gets paraded, and so it suggests that one of the core responsibilities of human beings is to name things, because that's kind of creative of your world. And I think what's true biblically is in some way true cognitively. It's that whole, I think for me, storytelling is about interpretation. It's about meaning. Gosh, there's a great book by Viktor Frankl, who was a Viennese psychiatrist who lived through World War II, was in one of these death camps. And he developed a treatment modality that he called logotherapy, meaning therapy. And his insight was that in these internment camps, the people who had something they were living for did better than those who kind of didn't. And so his insight was we're creatures that live out of meaning. And what he called meaning, I would call story or narrative. But we walk around trying to figure out, what does this mean? That's a story. That's kind of how I think about it. But having a common language and common framework, that makes a lot of sense to me. Any other comments, thoughts?
Father,
Go.
I
Yeah. Let me react to that in two ways, and maybe we can keep the wheels turning on this. One, I think, struggle, because we use the word forgiveness. We might explore that and ask if that's the closest word. I think part of what I think I hear there is about self-efficacy. Am I capable? Can I manage? I'm terrible at this. I'm not going to make it. So that strikes me, and you're telling me about myself. So thank you for, that's inside of all of us. And what we might say, I can't let go of this, might have something to do with, this is too much for me to deal with. I don't know how to get past it. But maybe that's not guilt as much as it's self-efficacy, and how do I kind of claim some power over myself. But the other reaction is, I would make the distinction between guilt and shame. And shame is not about forgiveness. Guilt is, I did something wrong, and that's a fairly mature kind of thing to feel, because it helps us to evaluate our behavior and our decisions and ask, how do I need to adjust this in the future so that life will go better for me and I can do right by myself and by others. And so guilt in that sense is a very adaptive feeling, and that's the realm of forgiveness. What you did was wrong, but we can correct it. Shame is not what we did or what I did was wrong. Shame is I'm wrong, and that's not about forgiveness. I've got to heal. Something about me is not right, and I would suggest that maybe that's a different kind of process that isn't a guilt and forgiveness kind of process. But we all kind of wonder about our being enough and our being worthy. And we've got all of these things that have happened that have validated the judgment that maybe I'm not enough and not worthy. See, look at everything that I did. But I think if we were to pull back the layers, that's not fundamentally about guilt or forgiveness as much as it's about shame and self-efficacy. That's a from-the-hip reaction, but I would say we would talk that through, and maybe that's all wet. I think that's my problem, shame and self-efficacy. Anything else? Any other thoughts? Everybody, it's good to be with you. So we're going to do the wine and cheese thing tonight. We've kind of flown over our 3 questions. Where are you? Where are you? What sort of things? And what are you looking for? Tomorrow we're going to kind of pull everything together and do a little wrap-up, and hopefully send you away with something to do about all of this. So I don't know if we have any business.
Just a reminder to please join it. Let me get up here so you can hear me. Although I've been told I can be heard. Just a reminder to please come on over next door. And also thank you for the donations that you're making, which help us to have a parish retreat every year. So I appreciate that. Some of you have donated online and in the hall and over here. So we just want to thank you for that. And we look forward to seeing you again. Father will be here tomorrow morning for Mass, and does a lovely job at that. And then, of course, tomorrow night we'll wrap up. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.